Okay, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Epistemics. I am joined by Sheikh Fahad Tasleem, all the way from it's Houston, right? Houston in America.
Yeah, Houston.
Okay, Houston, mashallah. How are you doing, Sheikh?
Alhamdulillah, good. How are you?
Very good, bro. Jazakallah khair. So today's topic is one I was looking forward to from the list of stuff that I've got planned for some of the other speakers to do with the Quran and why. Well, there's a few things I want to cover today with you. One of the things I want to sort of discuss with you today is why is the Quran such a misrepresented, unappreciated book? Right now, for example, and this is probably a good place to start. You know, if you look at, for example, the dialogues of Plato, right? People, they're thousands of years old, but people love reading them, right? And at the very least, they appreciate them as a piece of literature, something they can read, something they can, gain something from, they can study. The Old Testament, the Bible, the same story there as well. Shakespeare, the same story there as well. But when it comes to the Quran, for some reason, people don't even approach it from the perspective of, I don't believe it's from God, but at the very least, it's a piece of historical literature, something that's shaped a large part of the world, right? So why do you think that's the case?
I think there's a multitude of reasons. I mean, obviously, one of them has to do with just the perception of Islam in general, right? Across the world, and this is probably more so within the Western world, is historically how Islam has been represented. Of course, there's always been kind of this animosity going back, from the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which has kind of given a certain perception of Islam, like what we should perceive when it comes to Muslims and Islam. And therefore, if you have a certain narrative that's built around a certain group of people or a certain way of life, a certain religion, then you'll approach it in that way, and to maybe, let's say, ignore some of its text or not venture into some of its text. So to give you an example, let's say if you were living in the Bible Belt here in the US, and you go to church every Sunday. I mean, not anymore. Hopefully they're going virtually. But anyway, you go to church every Sunday, and in church they're telling you, well, there's this demonic religion that has come, that is Islam, and it's something that you should be very careful about. And this has been around the clock. That very kind of sermon is then being bolstered by like the representation of Islam in the media. And so really you think, okay, well, why would I need to engage with the Quran? I mean, clearly, it doesn't really have anything to offer me because it's clearly false from, my entire environment is telling me so. So maybe one of the reasons why it's not approached is just because of the general perception of Islam and Muslims. That may be one reason. Another reason, let's say maybe more academically it's not approached, is because it does present somewhat of a challenge when you're reading it, in the sense that it's not like a typical book that has like a table of contents, chapters, topics, and things like that, and there's a certain wisdom behind that. But if you're not familiar with some of the background of the Quran, it may be a bit challenging. So that would be number two. And then maybe yet a third reason is, again, it comes down to language as well, right? As we know, the Quran was revealed in Arabic, and translations are always a bit tricky to deal with, right? So perhaps the idea of a translation and kind of, how it presents the Quran may be a challenge as well.
Okay, there's a question I think that relates to what you're speaking about right now, Sheikh, is by Sahel Patel. He says, peace be upon you all. Any tips for learning the Quran? I want to read it in order of revelation.
In order of revelation. Oh, yeah. Man, that's an interesting.
This is quite common. I've heard. I'm sure you've heard this before as well. Some people want to approach it from the perspective, okay, why can't we read it in the way that it was first sent down to the Prophet?
Sure. I mean, I don't think there's a problem with reading it in the way it was sent down. It's just that in terms of historicity, it's difficult to ascertain exactly what was sent down at what point, right? So that might become a little bit of a challenge. I mean, a general structure of the of how the ayat and the surahs were sent down It's there, and you could technically do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, we have to realize that it was placed in the order that it's been placed in by the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ. And there are some, I guess you can say, shad opinions or some other opinions that mention that some of the surahs were placed in the place that they're in based on some of the opinions of the companions. May God be pleased with them. And there is a certain wisdom behind the placing of the surahs as they are, right? I think someone had mentioned, I'm not sure who, but they said if you think about a child, let's say someone who's born into Islam, right? And they're growing up. Typically, when children are growing up, the first things you kind of tell them are not very deep philosophical issues related to God and the names and attributes of God. Usually, what you're getting into is that there's a core belief, which from our perspective is part of the human construct, the fitra. And then you're trying to instill within a young child rules and regulations, right? Like how to pray, how to fast, etc. So when you look at the Quran, you'll notice that the surahs that come in the beginning, in fact, are like Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Al-Imran, and so on, which are quite heavy in terms of the ahkam, the rules and regulations. Whereas the later chapters are getting into more issues of belief and theology and philosophy, right? So it's as if a young child was to begin and read the Quran, you find that the rules and regulations are being established. And as they grow up, because they're going to need more of the theology and philosophy, that comes towards the end. So one of the wisdoms perhaps is that, it kind of tracks along with someone who's beginning as a child to grow up in Islam, right? And obviously the idea is that when you look at like the history of Islam itself, it started with a very small group of companions who the main thing that they were dealing with was issues of belief, right? And that's why what you call Meccan surahs are shorter and are more focused on things like belief in God, his names and attributes, heaven, hell, the day of judgment, etc. But for their context, that makes sense. But as Islam now spreads and it gets to like every corner of the world, now you have people that are born in Islam, and now so you have young children that are actually being brought up. So the rules and regulations are starting, and as they're growing up, as they more in need of like the philosophy and theology, they're able to get that by the time they reach the end of the Quran. And Allah knows best. I mean, that's one of the, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you said that, Sheikh, because see, I think you can almost call it one of the miracles of the Quran is that it served a particular purpose in the way it was revealed when it was first revealed, and that process of it being, or certain parts being revealed first and then certain parts coming later, served a particular purpose. So, for example, we know a lot of the Quran was revealed to address certain specific situations that were unfolding at the time. But then, subhanAllah, when it was preserved, it was obviously guided by Allah through the Prophet, peace be upon him, to be placed in a way which then anyone after that point, when they read it or they engage with it, they would engage with it in a way that it will benefit them best in the way it was structured after that. It's almost miraculous if you think about it, that here is a book that's coming down, apparently from an external secular perspective, its revelation is being dictated by history, the unfolding of history, right? It's subject to history from their perspective because it's dealing with situations. Yet when the revelation is complete and it's compiled, it addresses humanity for the rest of time, basically. That's just, it blows your mind when you think about it.
Yeah, it does. And just going back to the point of, the context in which it was revealed, I mean, we have to keep in mind that it was revealed over that 23-year period of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, right? After his, he touched the age of 40, after he was given prophethood. And like you mentioned, it was based on specific incidents that happened in the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, when you take that very text, and for someone that, let's say, analyzing the Quran, there are a lot of features of the Quran which, if you assume that the Prophet ﷺ wrote it or authored it, don't really fall in line with someone has gone through 23 years of trying to, let's say, put this text together, right? Certain subtleties, certain nuances, right? So this morning, actually, I was looking at Surah Al-Asr, right? There's a surah in, kind of the Meccan surah, Surah Al-Asr, wal asr innal insana lafi khusr. And one of the things that's very interesting about that is that the translation is by time, verily, human beings are in a state of loss. And the word that's used there is khusr. And the term khusr, it comes from a trilateral root, khasara, right? And this trilateral root, it means in a general state, a state of loss, right? So you're in a state of khusr, but it's a general state. So it could be a lot of loss, could be a little loss, but it's generally talking about humanity, right? Muslims and non-Muslims. By time, human beings are in a state of loss. So if you think about this term, khusr, whether you're Muslim or not Muslim, you're still at home dealing with this COVID-19 issue, right?
Yeah.
You're still feeling that. And that has nothing to do with your background, your religion, or whatever it might be. Now, what's interesting is that there is another term for loss that's used in the Quran, which is khasara. And if you look at the spelling, it's kha, sin, alif with a ra. So there's actually 4 letters instead of 3. And every time it's used in the Quran, the term ziyada or zada is used, meaning it's an increase of loss. So it's not just a general loss, but it's a loss that's even more than just the general human loss, right? So, and that's true everywhere you find this word in the Quran, all right? So I'll give you some examples. So for instance, in Surah Fatir, verse 39, وَلَا يَزِيدُ الْكَافِرِينَ كُفْرُهُمْ إِلَّا خَسَارًا, right? And basically it is the disbelievers of the kuffar, they have an increase in their khasara, right? In another place, وَاتَّبِعُوا مَنْ لَمْ يَزِدْهُ مَالَهُ وَوَلَدُهُ إِلَّا خَسَارًا. This is a place where the Prophet Noah is complaining to Allah, complaining to God, and saying that my people, right, asoni, they have disobeyed me. And they only follow those people who only have an increase of loss. But the term there is khasara, right? So every time you have this 4-letter root, right, the 4-letter khasara, you always have the term zid or ziyada, like an increase. But then you have a third term, which is khusran. And what khusran is pointing to, so you have khusr, a general loss. You have khasara, which is increased loss, meaning there's more than just what everyone else is going through. But then you have khusran, which is not only a greater loss, but it's even more intense. So I'll give you an example of that. Allah says, or God says from our perspective, خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ ذَلِكَ هُوَ الْخُسْرَانُ الْمُبِينُ, that they have lost in this world, in this temporary world, and in the hereafter, right? And they have khusranul mubin, they have this great loss. Now the word there is khusran, okay? In the sense that they've not only lost in this world like everybody else. Everyone's dealing with COVID, everyone's dealing with issues, financial issues, whatever it might be, issues with your spouse, but they've not only lost in this world, but a loss in the hereafter as well, which is intense. It is way more than a loss you'll have in this world. The term that's used is khusran. So out of these 3 terms, one of the rules that you find in Arabic is they say ziyada fil mubna or ziyada fil ma'na. In other words, the more letters you add to a certain word, it increases its intensity or its meaning. So if you look at khusr, that's a general word. When you look at khasara, the word ziyada is added, so that has a higher level. And it's always with a term like ziyada or zada, right? And then khusran has an even higher level, okay? Now these ayahs that I mentioned are disparate. They're all over in the Quran. And what we have to understand is that this particular accuracy or this particular precision of understanding that someone has the idea of a loss, then a greater loss, which is always attached to the word ziyada, and then the loss, which is even greater than that, it's attached to the number one, the Arabic term or the Arabic principle I mentioned. First, you have 3 letters, khasara, a state of loss that's general. Then you have khasara, 4 letters, which is a higher state. Then you have khusran, which is 5 letters, which is an even higher state, right? All of that comes together over a period of 23 years. So you really have to ask yourself, this type of precision, how did someone over a period of 23 years going through everything they went through, how were they able to keep this sort of precision within the Quran and be able to layer this meaning upon meaning based on one single word that has its various formulations? So again, my point, what I was trying to say is that you have these type of tidbits that are in the Quran that you find, and there's no sort of slacking within that, but it just adds layers of meaning. And you really have to wonder, how did a human being, no matter how much of a genius they were, over a period of 23 years, able to come to a book that brings all of this together, and there's never any sort of, let's say, lacking, right, when it comes to that linguistic aspect of just one word. So
what you're essentially saying is that the precision of the Quran is such that you would need, like, even if you had access to computers and editing software and you actually went through that process of editing and editing all on top of editing, you still would find it extremely difficult, if not almost impossible, to match the precision of the Quran, even down to the use of the word within a certain context.
Of course. And that's what I mentioned. And this is just one word. I mean, if you start analyzing like the words of the Quran, you know, that rule when I was talking about ziyada fil mana or ziyada fil mubna, ziyada fil mana, like that increase in letters indicates an increase in meaning. I mean, there's so many examples of that, right? I mean, like for instance, in you know, with Ramadan coming for the Muslims, you know, we have a surah al-Qadr, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, tanazzalul malaika, right? That the angels will descend on Laylatul Qadr, right? The night of our decree. But in another place in the Quran, Surah Fusilat, like the word that's used there, tatanazzalu alayhimul malaika, that the angels, now the same root, nazala, tanazzala, or tatanazzal, is used, right? Noon, zai, and la, right? It's to descend. In the first instance is tanazzal, one ta, one, so it's 4 letters now. Then the second instance is tatanazzul. There's now 5 letters and there's 2 tas. What's the difference? Well, what we know is that from the context of Surah Al-Qadr, the angels descend on one night. But from the context of the second ayah in Surah Fusilat, it's talking about when a person dies, angels now come down, and the word that's used there is tatanazzul as opposed to tanazzul. So why? Well, because on the night of Al-Qadr, that's one night in the year, and so you have one descension. But people are always dying every day of the year. So angels are always descending upon people who are dying. So in one context, you've got tanazzul, right? Once in the year. Then you've got tatanazzul because that's happening throughout the year. Again, these are just subtleties in the Quran, which you really have to ask, how did someone put it together with that sort of precision?
That's even going beyond precision where humans would appreciate it normally, because normally you wouldn't even pick up on these things unless you're someone that studies the grammar and someone that looks into this in depth, you know. And when someone does that, you would expect to find mistakes instead of even more precision, but that's what you find in the case of the Quran. I think there's a question here, if we can address this now, Sheikh. Jason Abbas, he said, why is there parts of the Quran that are difficult to understand, even from the point of view of Mufassirin? Can you please give your understanding? Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, look, there are, as the Quran itself says, there are ayat that are muhkam and there are ayat that are mutashabih. Okay, and these are 2 terms that are used in the Quran, and specifically in Surah Ali Imran, and I believe it's the beginning of the surah. I don't remember which ayah. But it's in the beginning of surah. Now, what the terms refer to in terms of ayat, muhkam is like, it's like locked in place, something that is explicit. Okay. Mutashabihat, the shabaha or tashabaha, refers to something that what you may call what's a good translation of this term? I mean, it doesn't mean that it's unclear. A lot of people translate it as unclear or allegorical, but literally it means when you have 2 things that are so similar that they're difficult to tell one from the other. So for example, the word that's used in another place in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, when Moses goes to Bani Israel and he tells them that you have to slaughter a cow. So one of the things that they say is that all of these cows, that they are in Al-Baqarah tashabaha alayna, that all these cows tashabaha alayna, they have the shabaha, they're so similar we can't tell one from the other. So when you have 2 things that are so similar that there's a difficulty in telling, does it mean this or does it mean that? It could mean this or it could mean that. That's what we call mutashabih. Muhkam are those things that are explicit, right? So to give a maybe an easier example, you and your friend pull up to a certain store and the sign says closed. Now you're not going to look at your friend and say, hey man, what do you think the interpretation of that is? What do you think that means? Right? I mean, it's clear, it's explicit, right? It's muhkam, it's locked in place, clear. But then you have other things that they may not be clear. And what Surah Al-Imran mentions is that the muhkam is how are the Kitab, and it's the basis by which you're able to judge the mutashabihat. But what's being highlighted here is that you use the muhkam to judge the mutashabihat, but the fact that there's mutashabihat means that there will be difficulty in some of those ayat. But that difficulty is not going to be in essential issues of guidance, right? So what I mean by that is, for you as a human being, when you're talking about my life, meaning, purpose, and all these things, there's no mutashabihat in that. It's not clear where it's like, okay, well, you have an entity that's Allah and that he's absolute, and it could be one or it could be three.
Yeah.
Well, that's very clear. That's not a mutashabih. But when it's mutashabih, it may be like, okay, a certain ruling in a certain area. Well, how do we understand that, right? Or even beyond that, when we talk about certain elements of the unseen, okay? Certain elements of the unseen, the idea is that they're al-ghayb, and because they're unseen, it's very difficult to understand them. So this goes back to what we may call like the philosophy of language, okay? And what I mean by that is that when you think about language as a philosophical endeavor, you have this idea of, you have words that have meaning, which are then trying to reflect reality, okay? Now, typically what happens is that when you're looking at words, they're reflecting a certain reality that is, let's say, a tangible reality, either something that you felt, concept like love or sadness, or something actually tangible like cup. How do we now express those things that are outside of our sensory perception? So the best that Allah can do, because he's using a limited form, right, which is language, in order to express certain realities that are outside of our perception, is to give us things like amthal, examples, right? That's why in the Quran you find many times Allah will say, daraballahu mathalan, that God strikes an example. Why? Because he's using a limited human tool, which is language, in order to express something that is just outside of perception, right? So sometimes the idea is that mutashabihat are there in order for us to understand our own humility, to understand we're not going to understand everything, right? We're still limited in our rationale, in our language, in the fact that we are human beings. And it goes back to the very core that if we had absolute knowledge, then you would be a being that is equivalent to Allah. But the very fact that he is a creator and we are created, our knowledge is going to be limited, right? And because of our knowledge being limited, because we are created beings, we will not be able to have a clear view of every single thing that is in reality. Let's put it that way, okay? Similarly, because of that, this is just a side point, because of that, we will also sin. Why? Because we are created beings and we don't have complete knowledge. Because imagine if you had knowledge and you had the foresight to know the second you sin, that this will be the result, right? Like the second you tell this lie, like someone calls your house and you tell your son or daughter, well, tell them I'm not home, right? Well, that's a lie, okay? But if you understood the consequences that, okay, well, this person, they missed your call. Let's say even in this temporary world, they missed your call, they assume that you're a liar. You end up becoming known as a liar, and that completely destroys your life at the end. If you saw all of the consequences of that immediately, the second before you're about to sin, you would never sin.
Yeah.
But the fact that that's outside of your perception, right? You're a created being, you don't have absolute knowledge. And then extend that to the hereafter. If you knew the exact consequence of your sin in the hereafter, and you knew that was absolute knowledge you had, you would never sin.
Yeah.
But the fact that you're a created being, you will sin because of your lack of knowledge, right? Yeah. But that's why we say that it's not only knowledge, but it's also the aspect of spiritual realities like humility, right? And therefore we understand that as human beings, we are going to be sinful because of a lack of knowledge, but at the same time, we have a tool, which is tawbah, which is repentance unto Allah, which is what we use. And that's why, that very famous narration of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he says that kullu bani Adam khata, that all of the children of Adam sin, but the best of those who sin are the ones that do tawbah, right? But it's interesting, the first part of that, all of the children of Adam sin by way of a lack of knowledge, because we don't have absolute knowledge by the fact that we are created beings. So anyway, that was just design.
Sheikh, wouldn't you say that in a way is a blessing from Allah? Because if we had insight into certain things, clear insight, like you said, that would mean that we're going to be held to account like never before. So, for example,
Absolutely.
I think it's in Surah Al-Ma'idah where the followers of Isa alayhi salam, they ask him to Allah to send down a feast, and when Allah sends it down, it's like, okay, if you deny after this, that's it. You're going to get a type of punishment that no one's ever received before.
Right.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And the humility point you made is very powerful as well, because it's from a psychological perspective, it's almost like, okay, if you truly are going to gain benefit from this book, you have to put yourself in place first and realize you don't understand everything. You don't have the ability to understand everything.
Yeah.
Even in Al-Baqarah, right in the beginning, it's the Alif Lam Mim. Okay, what does that mean now? Right? Even to the Arab or the non-Arab, even if you read a translation, you don't know what that means. Yeah. And then it goes on to say, this is a book, there is no doubt about it. It's from the creator of the heavens and the earth, which way you understand it. So humility is key. And even the ayat you mentioned about where the verses that are clear and with the shabihat, the ayah that comes after that, I think there's an insight there as well, where Allah says that those that have I think it's a disease in their heart or sound, they will just go and search for the meanings of those particular verses to find discord. So it's almost like Allah gives it away to us, like, okay, what's your state when you're approaching this book?
I mean, and that's important, because understanding your predisposition. Like you were mentioning Surah Al-Baqarah in the beginning, and it says that this is the guidance. There's no doubt about it. This guidance for who? For the muttaqeen. So if you think about what is taqwa, like it's, in a very kind of rudimentary sense, it's about someone who's very careful about how they're stepping forward, right? Like they're very careful. Now, a person who's going to be very careful means they have something to be careful about. There's some sort of motivation in that, right? Meaning that they understand that they're going to die. And then what is the consequence of that? Like there's a consequence after you die, meaning like there are actions that you do. So you really want to be careful. So there's a certain idea that you're going to approach the Quran. The people that are going to benefit from it are going to be people who are coming to the Quran with a state of humility and a state of like, they're caring about like meaning in their life. Like what is the meaning or the purpose of life? And it's not a predisposition which is coming like in a way to, let's say, like mock the Quran, right? Because in Surah Tawbah, for instance, there's a verse, and I think I have it here, is that وَإِذَا مَا أُنزِلَتْ سُورَةٍ, and whenever a surah is revealed, they're amongst those who start mocking it. Like, hey man, which of you has increased in iman? They're saying it in a mocking way. And then Allah says, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٍ, whereas those who have a disease in their heart, meaning they're not approaching it with a sense of humility or a sense of like, okay, maybe this might be true, or, I'm worried about, meaning in my life, the purpose of my life, what happens after I die. But they're just approaching it in terms of, well, just in this mocking fashion. And those people that have that, so فَزَادَتْهُمْ رِجْسًا إِلَى رِجْسٍ, so they have an increase in the filth upon the filth that they started off with, right? Rijs is like filth or sin. And that's how it proceeds. But as for the people that actually start off with this idea of, okay, this is going to have some sort of significance, and it behooves me to engage with this text as it's asking me to engage with it, right? To set aside my, my, let's say, my cultural, social, nationalistic, biases, and approach it the way it's asking me to approach it in a state of humility. And if you think about it, that's true with anything you approach, right? If you approach, like even within the scientific realm, if you are absolutely steadfast and obstinate with a certain, let's say, hypothesis that you have, and if it's wrong and you don't want to admit it's wrong, well, you're not going to make much progress, right? So too is the idea of meaning and purpose in our life. Like if you're open to that and you understand that life is temporary, you're going to die, something's going to happen. In that sort of pure curiosity, if you approach the Quran, it opens up for you, right? But if you don't, then it doesn't. So in this particular ayah, Allah's mentioning there's certain things that increase people in their iman, and there's certain things that cause them to actually decrease in their iman, right? The very same verse, or the very same surah. So,
and on the ayah you mentioned in Al-Baqarah, so when Allah speaks about the people of taqwa, and this is something that really fascinated me, that when they characteristics are outlined, when Allah mentions certain things about the people of taqwa, what are they? Who are they? The very first thing Allah says, الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, they believe in the unseen. So that straight away hits you. Like, think, okay, that takes a lot of humility, especially in the times that we live in, to not take the sort of empirical scientific paradigm, seeing is believing, and be arrogant about that. It's to open up and realize, okay, my ability to understand things is limited. My mind is limited. There's probably so much out there that's beyond me, and I have to just humble myself from that perspective. So again, the humility point plays in again. And I think it's a good place to start, Sheikh, which is we're talking about, okay, when you're approaching the Quran, there are certain things or certain traits you need to have it or try to have in place when you approach the Quran. One of the things that we've sort of got to, I think, is humility. Is there anything else you would say that's required for someone that's making their approach towards the Quran itself to study it or look into it?
Well, I mean, humility and an open mind, right? You know, what's interesting is in the group of ayat that you mentioned, the exact ayah is وَبِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ يُوقِنُونَ. That in the hereafter, it's not that they believe in the hereafter, it's that they're actually certain about the hereafter, right? Which is interesting, because if you think about, and I'm kind of taking a macro view now, right? If you think about any sort of system, worldview, or system of thought or belief, where do you find certainty? Okay, is certainty a purely rational endeavor? And the reality is no, because if you just use your rationale, you can never come to a point of certainty. Because what do we mean by I'm just going to use my rationale, right? And I'm not going to use any other tool, any other epistemic tool to do anything else, just rationality. But what you're saying is that you basically are going to doubt everything. You're going to question everything, right? But the problem is you can't question things infinitely. You can't say because this, because this, because this. There is no theorem that is infinitely defendable. You know what I mean? You have to have something that you can hang your hat on that's absolute, that's outside of rationality, right? So, like I said, you're not going to ask why. You can't ask why forever. You can't say because this, because this, because this. The example I give very often is, you know, imagine that my son, he comes to the kitchen and he pulls out a kitchen knife. And I tell him, I say, Abdurrahman, put that back. And he says, why? I said, well, because it's sharp and it'll cut you. He says, why? I'm like, well, because it's sharp. He says, well, why? I said, well, because the manufacturer made it that way. He says, why? I said, well, because we use it to cut things like fruit. He said, why? Well, because, you know, fruit may have better functionality when you eat it as a cut item. Well, why? At a certain point, I mean, I'm just going to be like, because I said so. Right? That's it. Because you can't ask why infinitely, right? And the thing is, if you say, look, I'm going to doubt everything, then that has another problem in and of itself. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to doubt everything, but then you have to doubt your doubt.
Yeah, doubt your ability to doubt, and then you're done, basically.
Right, and then you're done, right?
Yeah.
And nobody lives their life like that. Nobody like answers their cell phone in a state of absolute skepticism. They don't answer their cell phone and says, oh, it says mom. I wonder who that is. It says mom. How do I know it's my mom? You know, you pick it up. Oh, it sounds like my mom's voice. Is it really my mom's voice? How do I know it's? So nobody, they always start from a certain position of understanding that there's something absolute or something that they have to hang their hat on that they cannot prove per se, right? So this entire idea of proving things and starting with a position of doubt, in fact, one of the things we want to do is start with a position of certainty, that there has to be something outside of just rationale. We're not saying divorce yourself from rationale, but understand that there's two elements when it comes to approaching the Quran. One is that we are approaching the Quran at our core human-based state, right? We said humility, but I would say even more than that, understanding that there are certain realities that we know that are not purely rational, but they're what we call fitri, right? They're part of our core understanding. Okay, so for instance, the concept of gratitude, it is what we call a fitri concept and not an aqli concept per se, right? Like if someone does something for you, okay, you say thank you, but why do you say thank you? Let's say you're never going to see that person in your life ever again. They just hold the door open for you at the supermarket, like in a foreign country. Like let's say if I was in Christchurch, New Zealand, which I was in recently, someone holds the door open. I may never go back there, but yet I have this instinctive, instinct within myself say, okay, thank you, right? Yeah. But why? What is the, if you look at it in terms of like utilitarian worldview, like what is the benefit of me saying thank you to that person? It has no benefit. What the reality is the very concept of gratitude is something that's deep within the core of the human being. And that's what the Quran assumes when it's giving you, let's say, rational arguments as well. It assumes a core base state of the human being, which is good at its core, which understands things like concepts of justice, concepts of beauty. Like you can't rationally explain beauty if you think about it, right? You don't go to a, like if I went to to see the sunset with my wife and I said, wow, that's beautiful, and she's like, that is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Prove to me rationally that that's really beautiful. I mean, it's not about the rationality, right? So the point is that you have these core elements within the human being that when they understand that these are elements that, that's our construct, and then you approach the Quran, that's when your rationale actually kicks in and gives you the access to the Quran itself, right?
Yeah.
I'll give you just another quick example of kind of understanding kind of the depth of the Quran and the depth of the human being. So, we were talking about Surah Al-Asr, and there are a few words that are used for time in the Quran, right? So one of those is Asr. Now, Asr, you may call this like serial time, where you understand past, present, future, right? So we understand historical realities, we understand our present, we understand, that there will be a future if we live. Now, all of that is based upon the idea that you have a conscious reality, that you can observe these things at some point. But there's another word for time that's used in the Quran, which is dahr, which is not referring to serial time, but it's referring to, and again, the English doesn't really have anything equivalent, but it's like a time before you had the conscious idea of serial time, right? So, for instance, you find in Surah Al-Insan, right? هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ هِينَ مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. That wasn't there a time when the human being was not a thing that's even mentioned. Now, there was a time before you had an understanding of time, Asr, which was Dahr, which you didn't exist. And you weren't a thing that was even mentioned, right? Because where does the concept of time come from? Concept of time comes from the fact that there's an earth, that there's a sun, that we have like these, these cosmological realities that have to do with the day and the night. And so we're now able to calculate, okay, this is the day, this is the night, these are days, this is time moving. Before all of that, before your conscious state, you're in a state of dahr, right? Before you even a thing mentioned, right? And then basically the ayah goes on to say that, you've basically been created from like this sperm-like fluid, and then you've been given hearing and seeing, right? If you think about that, what is the reality of your state? Is that you were this fluid that if you were to see it, you'd be grossed out by it. And yet that's where you're coming from. And all of a sudden you're this human being that's able to hear things and see things, and you have this reality inside of you that's able to interpret all of that. And then the next ayah mentions that some of you will be shakir and some of you will be like kuffar, kafiran, right? Kuffaran. In other words, some of you have gratitude and some of you will be ingrates. So again, it goes back to the idea of our core state. Like, is our core state one of gratitude, not only gratitude to human beings, but gratitude to that which transcends us, which is Allah, which is God Almighty, right? But it goes back to the very core of you as a human being, right? What does it mean for you to be you? Like if we asked, like we have certain realities, right? We have a certain material reality. Sometimes I give the example, I tell people, I say, look, imagine, God forbid, you get into a car accident and you lose an arm. Are you still Imran? Well, yeah, you'd say, yeah, okay, I'm still Imran. I mean, let's say you lose an other arm, God forbid. Okay, you're still Imran. You lose your legs. Okay, you're still Imran. So what makes Imran, right? What is it, just this material being that makes you, you? This, because if that's the case, I mean, when you're losing these, so is there a piece of you that's now you that's actually gone? Or is there something that makes you, you that's deeper than that? And that's why there's a verse in the Quran where it says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسُوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُم. Do not be like those who forgot God, so God caused them to forget themselves. Now, if you think about it, the epitome of someone who's, let's say, forgotten God would be someone who says God doesn't exist, right? But they don't forget themselves. They still get up in the morning, brush their teeth, hopefully, right? Look for a job, get an education. So what does it mean? In other words, you have a core conscious reality that's you, that's your being, that's your ontological being, that's beyond just your physical body, right? From the Islamic framework, that is what's known as the ruh. your spirit, your soul that's been put inside of you, right? And so therefore, what the Quran is doing is more than just touching your physical reality. It's looking at something much deeper than that. Like, what is it about you and your spiritual reality that you should be looking for in terms of guidance? Like, what is the purpose of you as this construct of both a spiritual being and a material being? And bringing those two together, this has a certain purpose in this life. Well, if someone's seeking that purpose, then the Quran opens up for them.
Bro, so let me just ask you on that, Sheikh. So look, as we're aware, we live in a world at the moment which, it's the focus, and what people are being made to focus on is what's in front of our eyes, what we can see. We've been made to focus on the material aspects of reality, the material aspects of the human being, and what we're told is anything beyond the material, any metaphysical realms or realities of the human being or the world around you don't exist. And this has been drummed into people's hearts and minds so much that if anyone wants to mention stuff like this, it's almost laughed upon. Yeah, it's almost something. But to be honest, we go back, say maybe, I don't know, 2 centuries before this 18th century, 17th, 18th, 18th century, such understandings of the human being, they weren't just Islamic understandings; they were universal understandings. That human beings have a soul. They have there are other metaphysical realms to this existence, etc. But the world we live in is cut off from all of these realities. Now, that's a discussion in and of itself, whether that's deliberate and why that's the case, and how that may support other structures in place in the world today. But we don't want to go there. Where I want to sort of take the discussion now is, that being the case, do you think that's one of the reasons why people just cannot access the Quran? Meaning they may be able to pick it up and read it, but there's a barrier now because they've been an essential part of understanding has been removed from them, which is required to be able to access and understand and benefit from the Quran.
Sure.
Would you say that's the case?
Absolutely. So remember, we said it's not just a rational being that's accessing the Quran, right? Indeed, rationality is a big part of the Quran, but it's also the assumption that you're also a spiritual being, and that the Quran at its core is speaking to your spiritual reality. Now, if you take your spiritual reality out of the picture, then what are you really trying to access from the Quran? Is it like, how does the world work? Well, that's not the purpose of the Quran. The purpose of the Quran is guidance, and guidance in a much more broader perspective, as opposed to you as an entire construct of a human being. But back to your point about, like, that this, that there's almost like a curtain that's upon a person. Well, that's true. And I would say even outside the context of just the modern world, because that's one of the natures of, that's one of what you call like a disease of the heart, what's known as hubbu dunya, like love for this world, right? That you're so hyper focused on the here and now, right? Whether it's, okay, I'm only a material being, or whether it's, well, I just need to worry about myself, my material well-being, and that's it. That's actually a means by which you're actually cut off from understanding deeper truths. Now, what's interesting, and I think what's happened in in our recent, in the recent pandemic that we're going through, is that people are kind of, in a sense, some people are waking up to deeper questions about life.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense that, like, what does all this mean? Like, I was in this rat race, and trying to earn a paycheck and trying to pay my bills, get rich, whatever it might be, have a good relationship, whatever it might be. But what does it all mean, right? And when we try to find meaning, in things that are outside of, let's say, spiritual realities, you find that they leave us hollow, right? and they actually set us on a path that may be more problematic than what we start with. Okay, just to give you an example. Like, when someone's trying to find like purpose or meaning within their life, right? There's one thing that we can do is we can assign, let's say, a purpose, right? And so I think I was listening to someone who mentioned that when we talk about things like meaning, we may, or purpose, we may have a purpose to say, okay, let's say that our worldview says that there are power structures, and the entire worldview is based on those people that have power and those people that don't have power. And therefore, the very purpose is to now equate or make everything equal, right? And so therefore, because that's our worldview, and we just want to, let's, especially when it comes to like gender relations, feminism and things like that, the entire objective is to now overtake power. Okay. But there's a lot of issues with that, because number one, how do we know that that worldview is a true worldview?
Mm-hmm.
Is it true in the sense that we have an alternative by which we have traversed, where there is kind of no concept of power, or a flattened concept of power, where we saw that this is a utopia? In fact, we don't. That's just a myth that we've assigned as a purpose, and we're striving for it. What if someone says, hold on, it's not about power, but now it's about competence? Because you could say on one hand it's power, but on the other hand you could say, well, this is just related to like one's competence and their structure as them having certain attributes that are better than other attributes of other human beings. And that disunity is something which causes the human race to move forward. If you remove it out of the picture, you're going to be left with a lot of issues. Like I remember there's a book by Michael Sandel called Justice, and he has a Harvard course on it. And he mentioned that there was like this, you guys have cheerleaders in the UK? You know what cheerleaders are? No?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, well, I think
they have like their pom-poms, and they do like their dance and their flips and stuff like that at football games. So he said that there was a high school, and they had this cheerleading team. But one of the people who wanted to join the cheerleading team was on a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
So now they said, wait a second, how can she be a cheerleader? Because you have to do flips, and it's almost like gymnastics. So she said, so on one hand, you had people that said, no, her disability should not prevent her from being a cheerleader.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, someone said, hold on a second, but the very function or purpose of cheerleading is that you do these flips, and that's the very purpose. So now, if based on whatever worldview you're in, you're going to come to a conclusion that's going to be very problematic, right? How do you settle some of that? Well, you settle that by understanding that the correct view isn't about power, but the correct view has to do with the reality of your soul and your relationship with that which transcends you, and that is God Almighty, right? Mm-hmm. So the issue is that when we disengage from our spiritual realities, we disengage from we run into a lot of problems, both, let's say, politically, philosophically, socially. There's a number of issues that we run into. I'm trying to think. There was another interesting one, again, from Michael Sandel. He had this town hall, and he called a whole bunch of college students, and he asked the question. There was a German nonprofit organization, and this German nonprofit organization made a decision that they would give their funding or give their charity to the poor who are Germans first before giving it to anybody else, mm-hmm. right? And of course, there's a large Syrian population there, Syrian refugee population there. Now, people with a certain worldview said, hold on a second, you're talking about Germany, and whenever Germany goes down this racial path, it leads to problems, right? But the alternative argument to that is say, hold on, there should be nothing wrong with preferring German citizens, mm-hmm. because just like you prefer a citizen of your country, or just like you prefer someone in your family, you should be able to prefer someone in your country who's of the same citizenship. How are they different? What's very interesting is there were some people in that very gathering that said even the concept of a family and giving preference to your family is incorrect. We want to do away with familial relations because it leads to inequalities. Do you get what I'm saying?
Crazy.
And so now you have this, and this is where you get kind of the conservative versus, liberal divide. But look at what is the logical end of this sort of discussion? We're either going to do away with families, or we're going to, basically, hyper focus on nationality. But, if you enter into the idea of an Islamic framework, yes, there's an idea of family, but then there's also an idea of, okay, you have something like zakat, you have something like, the certain funds are earmarked, and that those rules don't come from human beings, but they come from that which transcends human beings, which knows the human beings better than they know themselves. So there's no idea of deconstructing families, but at the same time, there's no idea of a type of racism that's built in to, preferring one nationality over another. Mm-hmm. So my point in saying all of that is that when you take a worldview that divorces itself from your spiritual realities, you enter into a lot of problems.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point to sort of go off of now, and we can sort of go towards wrapping this up. But I think there's a bit more. If you've got a bit more time, Sheikh, just let me know how you're doing with time.
Yeah, good.
Right.
Good.
Okay. So I think it's a good place where we're going now, which is to do with purpose and meaning to life, right? One thing which is quite evident is that when you deny God, you deny Allah. If you adopt any type of atheism or naturalism or any worldview which sort of does away with God, just a general type of secularism, right? So you say you're not really an atheist, but you don't really talk about God, worry about God, or live as if God exists. Then you're going to run into huge problems, like you mentioned already, when it comes to values, ethics, morals, when it comes to meaning and purpose in life, right? These existential realities. There are no answers, Sheikh. Like I've looked into this a lot. I've suffered from this myself for many years. That literally there's no answers. And what we're seeing in the world today is that there is a shift now. People are starting to realize that this, materialistic outlook, it satisfies my worldly, material, bodily needs, but it doesn't do anything for me as a human being. So they're venturing out and looking into other alternatives. Some people are even now turning towards more ancient philosophies such as Stoicism and so all of this type of stuff. You've got New Age atheist spirituality, which is emerging now. Sam Harris, who are sort of piggybacking off of this. To be honest, Harris is very clever. I would say he's quite clever from some respects, as opposed to Dawkins. Sure. Because Dawkins, I would say, he's more of a traditionalist when it comes to his naturalism and his atheism. Harris, on the other hand, he's a bit more progressive from the perspective that he realizes that there is a need. People have this need. So he's trying to provide an alternative. He's writing about, spirituality on atheism. He has a course. He has an app, a paid for app. And he's making a good amount of money, I think, from his app and his enterprise in that regard, right? But the point being is that there is this need that's emerging, right?
Yeah.
I even watched a clip of Richard Dawkins this morning, a recent clip on a podcast where he asked him about meaning in life. And Dawkins was like, look, from a scientific perspective, the meaning of life is to propagate your DNA, right? But he says, I don't feel that. And these are his words. He said, I don't feel, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is what he said. I don't feel that. My meaning and purpose is something else. We want to write books. We want to do this. We want to do that. We want to do the other. But he was having a hard time justifying meaning and purpose under his naturalistic worldview. I think a lot of atheists, even the atheists that may be watching this later or that may be on live right now, they come to this channel, and I really respect them for this because they realize there are huge issues. I had a guy yesterday, there's a guy called Oscar, I think, and he comes to some of these live streams, and he's more of an agnostic, open-minded guy. He's like, what you're saying makes sense. There is no answer to these questions that we have innately. It's almost like our soul screams out, what's my purpose? What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? What's this all about? But on these worldviews that we're adopting, the answer is zero. It's just silence. It's like empty space. It's a vacuum. There's no answers. So people are looking around. So when it comes to Islam now, bro, this is something, whenever non-Muslims hear about Islam, they hear about, cherry-picked verses which talk about fighting here, killing this, doing that. Sure. Which are completely misconstrued, taken out of context, all of that stuff, right? Sure. But they hardly hear about how Islam addresses this deep human need for meaning and purpose. Now, can you shed some light on, okay, what does Islam have to offer from the perspective of meaning and purpose in life and existence? What's it all about? What are we doing here, basically, as human beings?
So I remember something that Sheikh Sha'rawi, he's an Egyptian sheikh, he mentioned. He said, when it comes to purpose, if you can say, and then what, then that doesn't really give you an ultimate purpose, right? You say, okay, I'm gonna start off in kindergarten, right? And then what? Well, first grade, and then what? Then you get to middle school, and then what? Then high school, and then what? And then college, and then you get married, and then, but ultimately, what does it come down to? Well, I go to college, and then I job, and then what? Well, and then I'm gonna get married, and then what? Then I'm gonna have children, and then what? Eventually, you get to the certain point, and then you die.
Yeah.
Right. So ultimate purpose has to be attached to something that is at the end ultimate. Mm-hmm. In other words, something that's attached to what happens when you die. Right. So if there's no clarity in terms of what happens when you die, it becomes very difficult for you to have kind of ultimate value or purpose with any sort of endeavor that you're going to be doing in this world. Like I was in an Uber the other day, and I was talking to the gentleman, and there's this massive school that was built in a certain, let's say, non-African American neighborhood, right?
Okay.
And it was like a $14 million school, like state of the art and everything. And the gentleman was African American, and we were talking. I said, man, That's so interesting that this school that's being built is $14 million, and it's crazy. All the students have like their own laptops and everything. And whereas in certain neighborhoods, like predominantly African American neighborhoods, the schools are like, you know, they're like shanty towns, right? I mean, they're broken down, you know, few good teachers and everything. And he's like, yeah, we should do something about that. You know, we should fight for our rights. And I said, absolutely. And then what? And then what happens when you get your rights? Let's say everything's equalized. Have you fulfilled the purpose of your life? Or is there something that's deeper than that? You know, and then what? And then you move on to the next thing that you're fighting for, the next thing that you're fighting for. But in essence, that's very shallow if it doesn't answer the question, what happens after you die? Because ultimately, that's where everyone's going. So one of the things that Islam is very clear and unequivocal about is the idea that your purpose is attached to what happens after you die, right? And that idea, what happens after you die, is, you know, conversely attached to what you're doing in this life, right? The sole purpose of why we're created is to worship Allah at the end of the day, right? And when we say worship, we're not speaking about like going to church on Sunday, singing some hymns. That's not what worship is. Worship is the utmost state of love of the Creator, coupled with the utmost state of submission. All right. So now you have to ask, well, if there is a Creator, is love due to that Creator? Well, you'd say, well, okay, if He created everything and He's responsible for everything and He has certain qualities, then no doubt He's due that love, right? But is He then due also submission? Because that's also a component of worship. Well, of course, because if He is all-knowing, or He has the, you know, he is the most perfect in terms of His knowledge, then He knows things that I don't know, and therefore submission unto Him is due. And you actually need both of these components for what we call ibadah in Arabic, right, or worship, right? Because if you have one and not the other, it's not really true worship, right? So, for instance, I could love, let's say, my children, but I don't submit to my children. I love them very much, right? Similarly, someone could submit to a tyrannical king, but they may not have love for that king. It's only when both of these come together, because of, you're talking about the ultimate reality of Allah or God, that you have the idea of what it means to worship. And the Quran is very clear in that. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I did not create all of you except to worship me. And so our very purpose is to worship God. And based on that worship, then we go to a day of judgment in the hereafter. And those kind of moral realities that we're struggling so hard to meet actually have a certain value. Because if you're just trying to do things simply for the sake of goodness, and in the end, after you die, they don't have any value, well, what does that even mean? Does it even have value? Like you're fighting, like, let's say for the gentleman I was speaking to, you're fighting for, let's say, these social justice issues. Okay, but when you die, what is the value of that particular fight that you went on to establish the rights of a certain group of people? As opposed to when you're looking at the Islamic framework, is that has a certain reward attached to it, right? And then having certain, and what about consequences about people that don't take a right path? Are they just going to die and then you're equated, right? As the Quran mentions, أَفَنَجْعَلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ كَالْمُجْرِمِينَ. Are you going to equate someone who is pious and righteous and submitted to God to someone who's a criminal? مَا لَكُمْ كَيْفَ تَحْكُمُونَ. What is, no matter how is it that you judge? Are you going to take someone like Hitler and equate him with someone like Jesus, right? Someone who spent their entire life in goodness, and their state is the same as someone who tends their entire life in like killing and slaughter, and you're just going to equate them? How is that? How are you judging, right? So the true meaning and purpose has to be attached to what happens when you die or after you die, right? And conversely, the very purpose of life has to be attached to that, and the judgment has to be attached to what you're doing currently with your life. And the true guidance for that comes from a source, coming back to the original topic, which comes from the creator of the heavens and the earth, which is the Quran.
Absolutely.
Can I mention one thing?
Go ahead.
About the Quran?
Yes,
So remember,
please.
we were speaking about, like we started the conversation off with like, how does a person, over a period of 23 years, how does that precision come about in the Quran, right? So we talked about like words and the precision of words. There's another interesting aspect of the Quran, which is called iltifat, which are like grammatical shifts. So I wanted to give an example of that, just to kind of bring our discussion back to the Quran. Would you mind if I did that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So remember, we were saying that, you know, we are a composite of both a spirit and a body, right? And the thing is, our conscious reality, I mean, if we're looking at where does consciousness lie from an Islamic framework, it lies within the ruh, or the spirit that's been placed inside of us by God. Now, there's an interesting grammatical shift in a chapter called Surah Sajda, right? The chapter on prostration. And what I want us to kind of focus on is the how the shift is going from first person to, let's say, third person, right? So just to review, since we're talking about English grammar, what's first person? I want to put you on the spot here.
Speaking to, so it's the self, isn't it? That's what you're referring to.
The first person, okay, yeah. So it's I.
So second person is you,
right, okay,
that's there in front of you, and the third person is someone that's like in the far distance, someone that's not with you, but you're speaking to someone else about a third person that's
right
somewhere else.
Third person means like he, she, it, like, you know, someone else.
Yes, yeah.
And then first person is me, and then second person is you, right? Very simply put. So just take a look at this group of, and this is talking about the creation of the human being and the fact that there's a bodily creation and then there's a spirit that's put inside the human being.
Okay.
Just pay attention. So it starts off from verse number 7. It says, الَّذِينَ أَحْسَنَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَهُ وَبَدَأَ الْخَلْقَ الْإِنسَانِ مِنْ طِينٍ. So he's talking about Allah, who perfected everything which he created and began the creation of man from clay. So right now we're in third person, right? So it's, you know, this basically created by God, third person. All right. ثُمَّ جَعَلَ نَسْلَهُ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِّن مَّاءٍ مَّهِينٍ. And then he made his posterity out of extract of liquid disdain. In other words, generations move forward that he created through this process. Again, we're still in third person, right? Now, here's where you have your grammatical shift, and I'll just focus on this for a second. ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِهِ. And then he proportioned him, again, third person, and blew into him or inserted within him the ruh, that conscious reality, right? That's how we, you know, when you hear something, you have the function of your ears and all of that, which is the sensory. But then what is the real thing that actually hears? Or what is the real thing that actually sees? It's not the actual physical eye, some sort of being that's your reality, which we say is the ruh, or the soul. So he says, ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِهِ. And so he proportions him, this being, and he breathes into it, this being, the ruh. All right. So far it's been third person, third person. Created.
So we're watching a story unfold right in front of us. Like,
exactly.
Someone, yeah.
So now it's all in the third person, and then he says, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ. So now the shift focus. Now that the ruh, the soul, is in the human being, it goes from third person to وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ, and we made for you hearing, seeing, and a mind. So the question is, why did it go from third person to second person? Why does it go from he did all this stuff to now he's focusing and saying you? Reason is because now that you have a ruh inside of you, you actually have the ability to understand what he's saying. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's very subtle, but again, it goes back to these subtle things within the Quran that really kind of testify to its to the truth value of the Quran. Like, how did someone over a period of 23 years, you know, with all the things going on in their life, come to something this subtle in terms of grammatical shifts, right? Third person. Now that you have a ruh, a conscious state, now it shifts. Okay, so now you can be addressed because you have the ability to understand what I'm saying.
And now you're responsible as well from that perspective.
Yeah, of course. Then it goes on later. Now you're responsible.
SubhanAllah. This is mind-blowing stuff, SubhanAllah. Sheikh, that brings us on to this question. I've had it up on the screen. I forgot to ask you earlier. But Hassan, Sohail, and I think let's sort of transition over into questions, and we'll wrap it up on any last points you want to make, inshallah.
Sure.
So Hassan Sohail says, and this ties in with the point you made as well. So this shift, this shift of pronouns, Hassan's asking about, is Sahih International the best translation, or do you have any others you recommend? So are there any translations that capture some of this beauty and these amazing features of the Quran in the English language itself? Or would you say a combination of different translations may do that?
So I would say if someone's starting their study of the Quran, is to refer to a few translations, right? Capturing these sort of things does require a level of study. But I would say that anytime you're going to engage with anything of value, you're going to want to put in time into that particular endeavor, right? So when it comes to kind of, understanding the Quran, a good starting place, I think a good translation is the Clear Quran by Dr. Mustafa Al-Khattab, which is good. That's a good starting point. But I would kind of combine that with other translations to kind of give you a more kind of a broader meaning that kind of covers some of these aspects. Because the thing is, look, no translation is going to give you 100% of what the other language is saying, even when you're looking from one language to another. So if you're going to translate something from Urdu to English, I mean, why is it that certain jokes in Urdu fall flat when you bring them over to English? Well, because it's a problem with translation, right? What's really interesting about the Arabic language, and again, going back to like the philosophy of language, is that as human beings, you have this concept of, you have words, meaning, reality, right? What we do as human beings is that we see kind of a concept of reality, and then we start to abstract certain words, right? Now, depending on the level of abstraction, you get, a categorization of those words and a certain number of those words, right? So to just make it simple, when we see a table, it could be square, it could be round, right? But we understand that a table, square or round, is a table. So we've categorized these things not based on shape, but based on functionality, utility, right? Which again goes back to worldview as well. Like, do we hold utility first or meaning of our life first, right? Anyways, so that's how certain cultures, they will categorize in their language shapes over utility. So if they see something round, it would be, okay, a football, a round table, and a round thing, and that's basically round things, right? Now, this process of abstraction, how we categorize things, is basically the more specific you are, the more sophisticated your process of abstraction is. So you have round tables and then you have square tables. But if you make a distinction to say, let's say a round table is called a roundy and a square table is called a squarey, whatever it might be, you've added 2 new words to your vocabulary. The thing about the Arabic language is that it has a very high level of abstraction. So they have words for very particular things, and that's why the vocabulary of the Arabic language is so vast and so large, like in the millions, right? Whereas when you look at the number of words in the English language, I don't know, is it like, tens of thousands maybe at best, right? Because the level of abstraction is much higher in the Arabic language. Now, with that level of abstraction, imagine trying to now translate that from one to the other, right? So a higher level of abstraction with a lot of words to a lower level of abstraction with less words. So what you need now is a higher number of, let's say, adjectives to describe something that's captured in one word, right? So what I'm saying, my purpose in saying this is that that's why you want to engage with a number of translations to give you a deeper meaning of what the Arabic is saying. But even better than that would be to engage in the Arabic language itself and to try to, one of the things is, so I took Arabic at a university here, the University of Texas at Austin, right? And what I realized is that I was maybe one of 2 Muslims in the class, and everyone else was actually not Muslim, right? But the interesting was that they were not having much difficulty navigating the Arabic language. So even though their primary language wasn't Urdu, which is relatively close to Arabic in terms of its structure, but they were able to engage with the Arabic so much so that one of our instructors, our TAs, spoke Arabic like an Egyptian, and if you closed your eyes, you would imagine that he's just someone that stepped out of Cairo, right? So really, I mean, it's a worthwhile endeavor. Obviously, as a starting point, engage with some translations, but eventually you want to come to, if you're really interested in meaning and purpose, is to engage with it in its original language if you possibly can. So.
Brilliant. You absolutely, I echo what you say about how easy it is to, compared to other languages, to start grasping it. I only started taking your advice seriously about vocabulary much later on, because obviously what's sold to you is the courses on grammar, right? Because that's more, it's more, you can put a framework, a time frame on it, right? 6 weeks, a month, a year. But when I was doing it at SOAS, I noticed that there were, like you're saying with you, there was mostly non-Muslims in the class, and they were taking to it just like that very easily. And there were Muslims in the class, but the non-Muslims were actually in some cases outdoing the Muslim students as well in the Arabic. And it was shocking because for example, some of them were studying it just because they were studying archaeology. and they just wanted to have it as a tool for when they study. Whereas Muslims are studying it for, we have much more reason to study and access it. It's definitely a worthwhile endeavor. Let me take you on to another question, Sheikh, which is, not question, but Muhammad Hadib says, Sheikh Shirawi said something beautiful. He said, plants have an objective purpose, animals have an objective purpose, the sun has an objective purpose, etc., etc. But what is the human objective purpose? So that's a very beautiful point, SubhanAllah. Everything around you has purpose, but what about yourself?
What's interesting, a lot of atheists, for instance, they've kind of denied purpose, right? In terms of like a teleology. But the reality is, like, you can't really move forward unless you have at its core a purpose, right? Like even with, like, let's say COVID, I mean, there's a purpose to find a cure. There is a purpose, right? And then when you look at something like biology, every kind of part of your body has a specific purpose. So if you deny purpose, well, you've got a certain problem. So, you know, a lot of universities, they do things like, oh, well, you know, history doesn't have a teleology and things like that. But even at the core of, let's say, biology and like the physical being, to deny purpose is actually quite foolish. Anyway. Yeah,
and to be honest, Sheikh, I mean, subhanAllah, you know, it's almost like those that deny Allah, Allah makes them as an example for people, because look, some of the people that are championing human rights the most, animal rights the most, even things like veganism and all of these. Now, I'm not saying right or wrong, but I'm just saying it's mostly the atheists.
You can say right or wrong.
Yeah, we can, but there'll be other brothers in the office that may disagree, right? Patel and so on. But anyway, the point being that they're the forerunners when it comes to these things, these sort of rights and values, but they're adopting a worldview which strips them from being able to account for those things. So they're living a contradiction, literally, right? There's a very interesting point here I'll mention in a second. Actually, I'll mention that Muqit Khan says, true atheists aren't taking advantage of their own YOLO philosophy, because it's almost their nature is screaming out to live in a certain way, but their worldview just doesn't make sense of it, you know. And I think most people are realizing this. Brother Dawah Motivation, Nadeem Ashraf, Nadeem says, Sheikh Fahad, how are you? Any more live sessions from you? Question mark.
Any more live sessions? Yeah, I have some stuff coming out, Ramadan preparation.
Has Sabur got hold of you yet?
No, not yet.
Okay, it's good. So I got you exclusively first, which is good. He's snagging everyone up, man. Every day he's got a live stream. Anyway, so where can they catch you, Sheikh? If they want to follow your stuff more, watch your stuff, your live streams, where are you more accessible to the public?
Man, I'm like all over the place. But obviously, IERA is the first place you can catch me, right? So stuff that's going on within IERA US, obviously when we're actually doing things on the ground. But otherwise, you know, I have a website, dcseminary.com. So you can go there and, you know, I'll be posting some stuff there. Also, I do a kind of podcast for a younger generation, which is called the Quantum Chronicles, which is completely different than what we spoke about today. But basically, it is a fictional story about a character who goes back in time and visits various historical figures. And one of those is the Prophet ﷺ. So we have the whole Sira, based on this fictitious person. So yeah, you can catch me there as well. You know, and of course online, Facebook, you know, Instagram, a lot of stuff's being posted there.
Send me some of these links. Send me some of these links, and I'll add them into the description box below, inshallah.
We'll do.
Brother Faizan Ali, he says the Holy Quran is full of counter arguments against atheist discourse. We just need to ponder upon the Quran in that perspective. I think it's a good point. I wanted to ask you something on this. Now, obviously, we didn't get time to go into, does the Quran have arguments? How does it address atheism? Does it address atheism? Does it address certain belief systems? Maybe for another podcast, inshallah, or a live stream. We could probably do in a week or so's time. But, you know, questions some of the youngsters, and especially the teenagers and those that are going into university ask a lot is, should we study philosophy, right? Or what should I, if I've got some time, what should I spend that time studying? Right, I got this question earlier today as well. I wanted to get your take on it. If someone has, say, for example, I don't know, 6 hours, 7 hours additional in a week, and they want to make the most of that time, you know, and they've got a choice between studying a few different things, philosophy, Quran, tafsir, whatever the case is, what would you recommend if they're looking at it from a dawah perspective as well? So what would you recommend that they study and they spend their time studying?
So I would say, specifically from a dawah perspective, you should be engaging with the Quran as much as possible, right? I mean, from what I have said for a long time is the best da'iyah is the one that knows the Quran the best, right? But you know, the thing is, if you have the Quran and you're able to, you know, articulate the Quran and understand some of its deeper meanings and things like that, and then express those, there's nothing better than that. I'll give you kind of a quick example. So we had I don't want to say debate. We don't do debates in the U.S., but we had a dialogue, right?
Dialogue. Okay.
We had a dialogue, and okay, so we had a dialogue, and 1 second, all right?
No problem. Take your time, Sheikh.
All right.
It's a live stream.
Give me 1 second.
No problem. So guys, we're going to wrap up soon. So while Sheikh Fahad comes back, if you have any questions you'd like to ask him, please leave them in that question pop-up box wherever you guys are leaving your comments. Inshallah.
All right, sorry about that.
No problem.
So real quick, let's see. So, oops, did I just mess that up?
Yeah, we can't see you anymore at the moment.
All right, can you see me?
Yep, we can see you.
Yeah. Okay. So the other day we were having a dialogue with a Christian group. Like I said, we don't do debates, but we do kind of friendly discussions. But one of the things they brought up, which is something that's brought up often with, you know, with, I guess you can say, you know, people that want to push Christianity, is that when they said, I think the gentleman asked something like, "Are you guaranteed paradise?" Right? And so this is something from a Christian perspective. Said, well, we're guaranteed paradise if a Muslim isn't guaranteed paradise, so therefore, you know, you should accept Jesus in your life, whatever it might be. You know, that morning I was reading a certain ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, right, where Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, "قُلْ إِنْ كَانَتْ لَكُمُ الدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ دُونِ النَّاسِ فَتَمَنَّؤُوا الْمَوْتِ إِنْ كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ." That say, if the hereafter is solely for you in exclusion to everyone else, فَتَمَنَّؤُوا الْمَوْتِ إِنْ كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ, then you should be hoping and wishing for death if indeed you're true, right? So I kind of brought that from the Quran. I said, look, if that's true, and I'm not advocating suicide, but what I'm saying is, if your concept, let's say, of paradise is like the Muslim concept, where we're talking about absolute bliss, that there's nothing like paradise, right? Then why are you wasting your time in this state of khusr, right? Why are you dealing with all these problems, your flat tire, problems with your wife, your children, you know, school, finances? Khalas, that's it. You should be wishing for death if that's the case, right?
Sheikh, that's a debate. That's a debate move right there.
What's that?
That's a debate move right there. That wasn't a discussion. That wasn't a discussion move.
But what I tried to stress was that, look,
Yeah.
I'm not saying this to win an argument, to be very honest, right? What I'm saying this is for a person, if that's what you believe, then ask yourself, is that the move that you're willing to take? That's why it says, in kuntum sadiqeen, if you're speaking the truth from an individual perspective. Like, if that's what you truly believe, then do you truly long for death? Or is there something there where you're not sure? Because if you're not sure, then that's something you need to kind of take a step back and reflect upon again. My point in mentioning that is that comes straight from the Quran. Yeah. Right? And, you know, I mean, and typically you find people that give, oh, well, you know, we're not guaranteed paradise, but how are you guaranteed? All these different reasons. But, you know, the Quran, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, ala ya'lamu man khalaq, does he not know what he created, right? You know, he knows what he created, and he knows the people and the arguments that they're going to be bringing, you know, so anyways, so a long answer to a question, which was start with the Quran, understand the Quran, and use the Quran in your da'wah. So.
Okay, are there any books that has the purpose of iltifat in every verse of the Quran? So anything specific books you recommend?
Iltifat. I mean, in English, maybe Neil Robinson has covered that in some areas. I'm trying to think. Neil Robinson has a book. I think he covered a few of the iltifat. But if you do a search online, I think a lot of cool stuff you'll find from Dr. Fadl As-Samurai, which is really, really interesting. He has a whole, I don't know, like, I want to say 500-part series. It's long. If you understand Arabic, he speaks in Fusha. So that series is really good as well. So you'll be able to you know, so it's called Lamasat al-Bayinat. So kind of like the gentle aspects of the Quran or something like that. But if you find that series, it's really good. So you'll be able to kind of not only iltifat, but other aspects of why certain words occur in certain places, what is the meaning of certain names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc. So, which is interesting because there's always combinations of Allah's names and attributes in certain places, right?
Mhm.
So why does he mention Al-Aziz al-Hakim, and here he says At-Tawwab al-Rahim, and so on and so forth? Well, why is the combination specifically for that specific spot? And it's very interesting when you get into some of that stuff.
I think Minas and Islahi has some really interesting insights.
Oh yeah, of course.
Onto
so,
the pairing of Allah's names and sense.
Right,
so,
right. I mean, if you speak Urdu, then Dr. Sar Ahmed is always good too.
Yeah, man. Old school, bro. Sheikh, that's the one. That's subhanAllah. We need to probably do a live stream on these individuals because I think they're very unappreciated by people today. And their works, and they're still accessible as well in the English and the Urdu. So definitely, we probably should do that as a live stream at some point, inshallah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
While I go through these questions, Sheikh, why don't you quickly, because I know there's some questions related to this, quickly just give us a study structure for someone that wants to study the Quran. So, say, assuming someone that doesn't know Arabic, but they're willing to learn. So, what steps would you give, and what books would you initially recommend? I know this could be a massive thing in and of itself.
I mean, look, I would say find a good, strong Arabic course and, start studying it. Because the reality is you have a lot of Arabic courses out there. You know, when I started studying back in the Stone Age, our choices were very limited, right? I mean, you had like university, and then you had, like, I'll be honest, when I started studying, we used to have something called Real Player. You know what that is?
No. Yeah, I do. Yes, I do. Yeah, Real Player is
back in the days of dial-up, you'd have this video to be really choppy.
Yes.
So there was a sheikh that had uploaded like 46 lectures on sarf, and then another 49 lectures on nahu, right? So grammar and morphology. And what I did is I went through all of them because that's all that was available. And then it just went to, okay, well, how basically taking books and taking an Arabic dictionary and just running those books with an Arabic dictionary. That's basically what I had at my disposal at the time, But now, I mean, look, man, pick a course and take it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's available online for free. You can take, there's YouTube videos that can do that. I think there's, actually there's, I'm trying to think now in terms of like books and things. I mean, there's a lot available out there, because I haven't been, I guess, in the online scene, I've been kind of more of at the university level, studying Arabic. So it's been, I'm not sure exactly what's available. But pick a course and complete the course. Let's put it that way. I think, for instance, Sheikh Akram al-Nadawi, Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadawi, he has an Arabic course.
Yeah, he's got a program, sort of one of those login things online. Those programs, it's called Deep Deen, I think. Deep Deen. It's really good. He's got Arabic there. He's got fiqh. He's got sulul fiqh. All of these different courses on there, mashallah.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're in it for the long run, I think he's got like 2 years of Arabic courses on there, from what I remember.
Yeah.
I mean, start, get the book. I think you get it as a PDF and just start going through it. If you're looking for something a little shorter, I think like there's a thing called Understand Quran or something. Somebody from India put together kind of how to use the Quran and vocabulary from the Quran and to kind of go through the Quran. Just if your focus is the Quran, you can try that as well. But just pick a course and stick with it. That's the main thing. Like anything that you do is going to benefit you, even if you're going to start with grammar. So, I mean, I'm a big proponent of vocabulary, but I understand that you also need grammar as well. But just get started. One of the things is that if we think of Arabic as a language and we get scared and we don't start anything, then you'll just never get started. So pick something and just stick with it, even if it's 10 minutes a day. Just do something, So that's probably not the best answer, but anyway.
No, I'm sure it'll be beneficial to everyone watching. Last thing, Abdullah Nabil is asking for your Twitter, Instagram, social media handles, things like this. So please share them with me, and I'll share in the description box too. So we'll wrap up here, Sheikh. What we'll do is maybe let's do another one in about a week's time or something.
Sure.
And let's maybe go into some of the specific arguments the Quran presents, the cases it presents, atheism, all of this type of stuff, inshallah. But I think this was good for an introductory, inshallah. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, man. Just everyone should, stay safe. Try to, practice your social distancing, inshallah. I know this Ramadan is going to be really challenging, but, try to look on the brighter side of things. This is a time when you can have a lot of introspection, spend some time with the Quran. That's a bit different than your Taraweeh. If you're, it's considering, most of us will be going to the masjid. So we were talking about engaging with the Quran. It's as if Allah has is kind of forcing us into a position where we have the time to actually engage with it. So that time you can spend in Taraweeh, obviously spend some time, worship Allah, make your prayers, but also try to focus on the Quran, right? This is like, in a sense, it's a test, but in a sense, it's also a gift with this Ramadan coming. So it's going to be challenging. Maybe no more samosas and pakoras and whatever else you're going to be, no more dawats or whatever it might be.
Trust me, that stuff kills your brain cells. It like literally, you can't think after you. Yeah. So I was just trying to remember. Someone said something about not just the way the appetite, if you overeat, just affects your ability to learn and to study.
Yeah,
I'm sure many people have said stuff like this.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, maybe we can do another session just on that. I mean, there's sections in terms of like, how food actually affects your ability to even understand the Quran, for instance, right? I mean, most Hufad, when you ask them who are leading Taraweeh, they never eat that stuff. I mean, I've yet to come, at least in the States, you tell them, they're like, no, we're not going to overeat because we'll be midway through Taraweeh and we'll be like throwing up, right? So we can't, So that applies for them. I mean, how much more so for us, if we're going to be studying.
I think Pakistanis are probably slightly cut from a slightly different cloth with stuff like that. It's just genetic, I think. They don't know it. I'm sure if there's the way they were to eat like a sandwich and a salad, they will probably never be able to lead Tarawih after that. But yeah, inshallah, we will pick up on this next time inshallah we will do this. Jazakallah khair. Sheikh, there may be some other questions in the video after it's posted. So what I'll do is I'll send you the link of the video. Maybe tomorrow or something, just check back and see if there's any specific questions for you and you can address them inshallah there.
Sure.
Sounds great. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Jazakallah khair, guys, for coming on live. Please make sure to share this video, make sure to subscribe, and we will speak to you guys next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.